All right, I'd like to call to order the policy committee meeting, June 2nd. Note that all members are here, Judy Engelbrechtson, Katie Goetzer, and myself. I'd like a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
I know that we had an email come in for public comments. I don't know if we have, I don't think we have anything more than that. So discussion. So, next one, we'll discuss the policy review process.
Right, super. Thanks, Ted. I want to take a few minutes and show you a little bit about what you're getting into as a committee this year. This is going to be a really active committee. Ted and I met with some of our attorney representatives at the School Board Association to kind of lay out what our process will look like. One of the things you will find as we start getting into these policies, our last full review of this was probably 20 years ago. And then through time, you pick and choose different policies that we've updated. But I think the challenge is that we don't have really the consistency across the entire breadth of our book as far as what that looks like. Katie, just as a little background, there's a few different options you have for kind of reviewing policies. One is you kind of take it upon yourself and really the administration, the board, write the policies. That's certainly a piece I've been part of in another district. It's incredibly time intensive, and it also leads us to probably some pretty higher legal bills because there's a lot of things that have legal implications. It's also a process that I just worry we would ever complete. So that's the form process. There's another one that's the flip side. There's a company called Neola, which really has a bank of lawyers that write policies, and they trademark them, they copyright them, and then they basically they sell that package to school districts. And then what a district in my previous district, that's what we used, and then you would adopt their policies, and they would have different samples. So you'd have policy 100, and there'd be 3 different samples, and you choose which one you wanted. But you really didn't have much of an ability to say, well, I like this policy, but I want to add my own paragraph. It really didn't allow very well for that. Many districts use them because then what you will do is you'll meet quarterly with them, and they'll update you on the policies that have come out, what's been updated. So you're always up to date, but you don't have a lot of ability to customize and make things kind of your own here. You can always add your own policies in, but as far as editing ones that are there, it's really much more of a deliverable program. I would say we're kind of in the middle, and what we're looking at is working with the School Board Association, who has now really created, they've created something called the Policy Resource Guide, which we've now subscribed to. So can I pull that up? I can grab it up here. Next one over. And this is really where they've gone through, and I'm just going to grab one here. Grab something here. These are the 300 policies. And let's just say you wanted to look at curriculum development improvement. That's not a big one. So that's probably that. There you go. So here's a policy on career and technical education. And then they've given you 2 different policies. So they're going to give you some policies that are written. They're written by the School Board Association, looking at kind of model work in there. Dan Mallon, who's an attorney with the School Board Association, is also a resident in Waunakee, and his kids go to school here, is one of the people that leads this up. So we've worked very closely with Dan around this. And basically they kind of create different, kind of a Neola type feel where you have a couple different policies to choose from, but you also have free reign to change them, modify them any way that you want. I thought it was important for us to purchase into the Policy Resource Guide because that gives us now at least a place that we can go and start to look at what are the sample policies and how do we kind of go about updating them. The other piece that I think is important is trying to save as much of our administrative time as possible. Because I mean, just using like the 400s policies Chris has been kind of looking at and working on, to have her spend her entire time kind of going through and paralleling this guide with what we have, and then trying to write something that we feel may meet our needs is certainly something we can do, but it's also pretty time intensive. It's better than the first one where you can write from scratch, but it still has a highly impactful time impact on us. One thing that when Ted and I met with the School Board Association folks was I asked them if they can go through what they did for the 100s and 200s series for us was they did some of that initial work for us. They went through and looked at what they have in the resource guide. They looked at what our current policies were in the 100s and 200s. And then they made some recommendations. They put it on a spreadsheet for us, and they made some other notations that said, we recommend you keep your policy. We recommend you adopt one of the policies within the policy resource guide. We recommend you merge them, and that there's some good things that you have that are locally developed. We recommend you do that. Or we recommend that you can get rid of your policy if you want. And they've also looked at it and said, you know what, you've got 4 policies on one topic, but our approach is we combine them. So they do some of that work for us. And it at least then gives us a guide to walk through. So that's really what I'm recommending. And that's what we've put out for the School Board Association to give us kind of a quote on what the next, I think I asked them for the 300 series policies, for them to give us a quote of what it would cost for them to go through and review that. And then for us then to bring those pieces forward. So they haven't given that to me yet. I have not seen that yet, but we'll prompt them in the next few days to see if that comes through. But I think that's probably the most efficient way to do it. What they will do then is then we will put together a binder on that so that we can kind of go through it together. Ted being the chair, will sit down and go through what the recommendation pieces are after we've looked at it administratively. And then we'll have a recommendation coming to the committee here. But in order to keep that process moving, so we don't get bogged down, we probably need to meet like every month or most months. I think that'll be it. There may be sometimes we just have to make sure that we have the correct body of work coming forward here. We're also in a little bit of a unique time in that we're trying to redo our entire body of work of policies at the same time that there's policies that are coming up that we know need immediate attention. So what you're seeing today is things that are kind of jumping forward in the sequence because they're things that members of our team have identified and that we feel are important to move forward. And when we get then to that series of policies, that one will at least be done, or it will be something that we will then review with another critical eye, and it may come back to. I mean, you've seen the advertising policy a couple of times over the last 6 months. When we get to that part of the policy book, I anticipate that one probably getting rewritten. But at least right now, it's addressing the immediate needs we have. We have a few of those things on residency, etc. Policy resource guide puts that all into kind of like enrollment into a school district policy, which is a much bigger issue. But for our immediate needs, for what Julie Gagler needs for the summer, this will address our immediate. So it's going to be a little bit of a mix of both, seeing things that are coming through after a very thorough review, and also a mix of policies that you're going to see that we just feel we need to move forward. And you may see them again, or we may adopt something out of the policy resource guide and move forward. So it's going to be a little bit of a mix as we start to kind of go through the process. But I think over the next, I would anticipate the next 2 years is what it's going to take us to get through it. The other part that this process that is they also have, and I'm not very good at navigating this.
This PGR.
Yeah. Is the one thing that this will also do is once we adopt and we've purchased into this, one of the things that Rebecca and I are trying to get into our workflow is these policy resource guide updates. And what they will do is that the School Board Association will continue to update policies as things either legislatively change, things per like court cases change, or they start to see new topics coming forward that they feel that districts want policy written on. And so like for this one just came out on May 10th. It's a high priority and it's dealing with, that's a whole package of it. Here's another one. Here's one that they would view as medium of importance. It's on concussion management. So obviously that's a growing topic that districts are dealing with, particularly in their sports arenas. and that they feel like there should be some policy or consideration for policy on it. So it gives us now a place where we could go, we could take a look at what the sample looks like, they've already written it. As opposed to us saying, like Aaron May saying, we should have a policy on concussions, and then him writing it from scratch. So that's really what our process is looking at. So Ted, anything to add from our conversation that we had?
No, the attorneys were wondering their level of involvement, I think, past providing this initial quote, like would you like us to sit in on all of these? And I think it was our belief that no, we want to take it now, and if need arises that we need to bring them in, they'd be there to do that, obviously at a cost. But,
Right.
I think, you mentioned purchase this, I think it was a 3-year, did you say?
Yeah, so the purchase of the policy research guide, I think it was $13,000 broken out over 3 years. So it was total of 13 over 3 years. And then after that, then the cost drops down to, I'm forgetting, it's a few grand a year, but just to kind of continue to use the maintenance aspect of it. And then on top of that, you have some of the costs to kind of do the extra work that we're requesting. I think all that's worth it. It's a piece that I think what Steve and I have talked about will be part of like our consulting budget. So for the next few years, as we go through that work, we'll tie it into there. So it's not an additional budget expenditure that we're going to have to determine. It'll be part of an already established budget that we use for purposes of this. Katie, you had a question.
No, I was wondering about the PRG updates.
Yep.
How we'll manage that. That will be something that our committee will look through, or somebody.
Rebecca and I will do that. She'll kind of,
Okay.
as what we're looking at is, do we look at that like either on a monthly basis? And then we determine between she and I, which ones that we feel we need to bring
Okay.
forward. And so that'll be kind of a third tier. It's kind of the review of the ones that we're going to be doing through with the School Board Association, the one-offs that we're bringing because we've identified them administratively, and then any updates.
Okay.
So that'll be kind of what and hopefully we can get into a good flow as we move into it. I anticipate it'll take us a little bit to kind of get into that process, but I think we're in a good place as of right now. So. Any other questions?
Moving on.
I'll let you navigate now.
All right, next topic, services and programs for English learners. Chris is here to.
Let me kick these next three off for Chris. One of the things that Chris brought to me was a few different policies that she's identified, particularly as we see some student needs throughout the year. Certainly, we've had an influx of our English learners. We've had some changes as far as programmatic things that we've had to look at. And as she was reviewing it from a policy perspective, the English learners was definitely an area that needed to be revisited. I'm just going to, when I kick it over to you, Chris, you can walk through the next three policies. We'll deal with them each individually. But there's also a piece, we did not have a policy on homelessness, which is definitely an area that we've also needed to address. And then student mental health and wellness. This is really one that Chris brought with regards to an increase in like suicidal ideation issues that we've been dealing with and realizing we didn't have adequate policy around that. It's one that we'll talk about, and it's really what the public comment on from Mr. Brandt that came in was referencing. So we'll take each one of these separately, but we'll start off with Chris, and if you want to start with the one on services and programs for English learners, if you can just bring that one up. All yours, Chris.
Awesome. So as Randy mentioned, this is an area where we're continuing to grow, and we do not have a policy around how do we establish, how we screen kids, how we provide services for our English learners. And so this is an example I took from, I think it was the School Board Association as well, but drafted last year, and I don't believe the policy committee has met much last year, and so kicked it back up this year. So this will be one that will probably change as we have hit the threshold for bilingual programming. Right now, we're focused on an English as a second language model. And so this is geared toward that. But as our programming model changes and shifts, we might want to tweak this. But for now, it's A lot of it will remain though, of course, it's in compliance with the Department of Public Instruction's English Learner Policy Handbook on how we identify students who may qualify for English language services and how we notify families and their option to opt out or decline. So a lot of that will remain, but our type of focus on ESL model will, that second paragraph in particular is in there for now, but that might need to be tweaked. So this is a new policy. Any questions on this?
What you've really done, Chris, is you've kind of looked at where we are programmatically and then looked at what the guidance was from DPI
Correct.
and trying and really putting this together. So this follows a pattern you'll see in a lot of the policies, is that some of them are just putting out in front of kind of our community and a policy perspective, things that you can find similar language to, like on a DPI site through a handbook. That really kind of outlines what the processes, and also any of the legal requirements around it.
Remind us again, I mean, there's maybe the percentage of students that this falls into the category, this falls into, and the variety of different languages. Again, it's kind of amazing to me.
Yes, I think we're at around 130 English learners in our district. Of the current services we provide, English as a second language services, we provide those in 15 different languages. That doesn't say we have like 20, close to 30 home languages that are different. But as far as when we're servicing kids as English learners, we have 15 different languages. So ESL models will continue, that English as a second language. The bilingual programming is where we hit the threshold is with our Spanish speakers. And that's where we're looking to have bilingual programming in English and Spanish. So
The majority of our students that fall into our 130 are Spanish speakers, but you have them pockets of the other ones that are Mandarin Chinese or many of the other 14, 15 that we have.
I assume they're at all levels. So
all levels, yes. Right. And so part of this policy is discussing how do we screen, how do we notify parents, even starting with enrollment procedures and then programming and progress monitoring. When students exit out of English Learner Services, we still monitor them for 2 years after. So just kind of going through and defining that in the policy of how that works.
Where are we on our bilingual services? Are we up and running or next year? Or?
So we have a waiver for next year because we just had our final work group meeting this month. And I think we have an idea of the direction we're going for bilingual programming. So then next year will be used to plan that bilingual program. So the board is already, with the transfer of service money, being able to hire bilingual teachers, and they will be part of that planning as well. So as far as staffing, I think we're pretty good. We have one vacancy left that we're still trying to fill for bilingual teachers. But as far as where we're at with bilingual programming, one more year now to plan that model. And some of that will be like notifying parents in February and March of the option for bilingual programming for the 23-24 school year. So we have some deadlines we need to meet. So that planning will start in fall right away.
It's definitely a piece that's been a growing area for us. And we saw last year a lot of our students that moved in, many of them were Spanish speaking. That's what pushed us over the threshold. That's why we came for the waiver for this year. And if you recall, just a few months ago, we applied then for the waiver that the board approved for next year, and that was approved by DPI just in the last couple of weeks. So that allows us the time to continue to service our students, kind of start looking at how we're hiring staff, which Chris has been very active in, and then also putting that program together for the subsequent year. Interesting conversation I had last night. I was at a meeting where there was a person from DPI who works in this space, and she was just telling me that this is a repeating conversation across the state. She gave me an example from like Trempealeau County, kind of more towards the Cross Twin Cities area, and just the quick influx of families with Spanish-speaking backgrounds and how it's really pushing some of the bilingual programming across the state in many different areas. So sometimes it's driven by kind of agricultural changes and bringing in families that are working in farms. Other times it's being really driven by certain industry that's kind of where you're finding a higher population of workers. In our community, I know Unique has a number of families that are Spanish speaking that work in their organization. some of the things that they're doing are in two languages as well.
When we first
Definitely a
did
growing
that,
area for us.
it is, when we first applied for the first waiver, we had met the threshold at Heritage. And then this current school year, we also met it at Prairie and we're one away at the high school. And, you know, I think the middle and intermediate we had a traditional middle school probably would have also hit the threshold, but because they're divided up by 5, 6, 7, 8, that gave them a little more flexibility. But we're looking to have bilingual programming district-wide now. We're planning district-wide rather than when we initially thought Heritage. So exciting work.
The wide range of kids that we receive are everything from a student who's coming in who's family's language at home and they speak very, very good English. But then it's an assessment is, do they speak English well enough and understand it well enough from an educational standpoint? That's part of what that's that assessment, all the way from children who come here who really don't speak any English. And we're working with them to help them to learn the language, but also trying to educate them in the process so that we keep them. Policy is important as we can move forward. As Chris said, this will be kind of the first iteration of policy on this, but we think it's an important one to have something written that provides guidance.
So we're pushing this as our policy.
Yep, this is one we're recommending that the policy committee take action on today and recommend to the board. Next week.
I move that we accept this policy and move it to the board.
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Wake up.
Thanks, June.
Okay.
There you go. Awesome.
Actually, didn't hear what Katie said.
Oh,
Another question or something.
sorry.
No. All right. Moving on to the next.
All right, homelessness.
Yes, so this is also another similar situation that we don't have a policy currently and really should have a policy. Again, looking at how do we identify students who are experiencing homelessness? What defines that? Like the definitions, what is an unaccompanied youth? School district of origin, school district of residence, what is our responsibility as a school district? And then also outlining and needing to have a dispute process in case there is a dispute that would come up. It's important as well. And so nothing that particularly happened that drove this. It's just, you know, looking at getting updates from DPI and then going to see what our policy says and noticing we didn't have a policy was the reason behind getting that moving forward.
And again, you looked at everyone else. In terms of guidance on this.
And we didn't have the resource at the time. Again, this was drafted last year. However, also tapped into other school districts, looking around the area, other school districts policies, working with Jessica Main, who is our transitional education coordinator and works with students who are experiencing homelessness and kind of working through the dispute guidance to make sure that she's also comfortable with like how this would work and how DPI recommends. We consult with DPI quite a bit. If there ever is something we anticipate could be a dispute with a family who's experiencing homelessness, we usually call our contacts at DPI and consult. We want to avoid disputes, of course, but making sure we have this written out as steps to follow if there was one.
Yeah, I see it as a good policy. We've had homeless children. When you look at the definition, we often think of homeless as families living on the street. It's got lots of different definitions. So we've had obviously homeless families and children for a long time. Putting more of a concerted policy to it's important. I also see this as one that will have a policy, and I think it's well written as we've reviewed it. We can then kind of look at that as we do our review with the policy resource guide. So it may be one that we tweak, but I think it's one that's solidly written and that may actually stand up. So it's important for us to get in place so that we can, as we start to move forward here, that we have it for summer.
Questions on?
Oh, sure. So motion to bring this policy to the board for approval.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Next one, we have student mental health and wellness. This is only had public comments on from Mr. Brand. I think he brings up some very important pieces for us to take a look at. When Chris and I met about this, particularly following the public comments, one of the things that we looked at was really what was the purpose of the policy that she's putting forth. So this is a rewrite and a revision. We took a look at the policy resource guide, which really addresses some of the mental health things a little bit differently. So we felt that it was important to move this item forward at this point, but then we'll be reviewing it when we can get to that part of the fuller policy review. I think what we have, Chris, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that our current policy on this is titled Student Mental Health and Wellness. But it was really focused on some of like the suicidal type things. And that's definitely been an area that we've seen some activity, and certainly with our student services staff working with families and students on in the past year. And as Chris was reviewing this, she felt we really needed to have some stronger language with regards to that and some better guidance on it. A conversation that we may want to have is, as opposed to throwing everything with mental health and wellness under, is this a better policy to be titled something around suicide practices or something of that nature? But some of the items that Mr. Brandt brings up with like mandatory reporting, those are some separate items within other policies, which I think are good for us to take into account when we review them. I'm not sure at this point if they fall within specifically this policy or are necessarily germane to some of those pieces. And I know, Chris, you reached out to Child Protective Services yesterday from the county just to kind of have a conversation about what we were trying to do with this policy, and particularly with regards to the public comments that came in. And we felt that we were probably in an okay spot with this policy, but some of those concepts may be things we need to review as we look at other policies. That's accurate. So you want to talk a little bit about kind of what brought this policy forward? What were some of your kind of initial thoughts around it, and what some of the changes were? Because I think we've actually attached the previous policy, and I think you heavily changed this one. We just attached both so you could see them.
Sure. And actually, just to clarify that the student mental health and wellness is my new title, which can be changed. The original title for the policy was positive emotional development of students. And so just tweaked that a little bit. And then for the procedures, I kind of kept with that student mental health crisis response. But after reading the public comment and kind of reflecting on the past title was suicide prevention procedures, maybe we do want to change that to more specific to suicide, because the procedures are really addressing suicidal ideation. So really this came out of, this is 20 years old, this policy, and talking more about our MLSS, our multi-level systems of support, and how we meet the social, emotional, and mental health needs in the different tiers. And also this came about because we revamped during COVID. We started the work before COVID in the 1920 school year, but it carried on through COVID, and we felt it was just really important to update our suicide risk assessment process and protocol for student services, like the steps we use, the tools we use. And so I wanted to align our response, our process, and our rules to align with how we handle it based on our suicide risk assessment protocols, and making sure that they were in touch with each other. So that's really what kind of came about updating this, is updated language around how we address student mental health, social emotional learning, mental health, and also aligning this with our suicide risk assessment processes and protocols.
So would you recommend we change the policy to the name of the policy?
I can update the name for the procedures or the rules to suicide, to focus on suicide. I do think student mental health and wellness is a fairly decent topic for the policy, but I would be open to discussion if we wanted to keep it positive emotional development of students.
Either one's fine. And I think it's really getting at some of your concerns about your processes for looking at how we address and assess the suicidal ideation that we're seeing with students.
And the student mental health crisis response, I could see where that would be a little confusing for the rule, because I think we need to name it suicidal response, or response to suicidal ideation, because student mental health crisis does fall under a couple other policies that we do need to look at as well, around if we have a mental health crisis that involves a threat to others, then we'd be doing threat assessments, and that falls under a different policy. And so definitely changing the name for the rule and a reflection. So.
Right. So changing the name to it to more reflect the suicidal ideation process.
So what's coming before the board, if we say, let's do this, is cleaning up the names of things, the titles of things?
Just the one title for the rule, I think.
Okay.
And the title of the role and then the process that's in place is in line with what our current practice is.
go back to suicide prevention procedures.
Yeah, that works.
Seeing that it is more focused on the individual and self-harm, is Mr. Grant's comment in terms of adding and others in there? That's the validity, like not just harming yourself, but and others. That's the one comment that he made about that. I don't. Any
that's a
thoughts about
piece-
that?
And that's a piece that Chris and I were talking about. We're kind of jumping from where, at least our read of it since we received this late yesterday afternoon to this morning, was there may be references to a few different statutes. And that's part of what we're trying to kind of determine is where does that fit? Does that fit best within this policy, or does it fit within the consideration of one of the other policies on mandatory reporting? So that's a piece that she and I can continue to look at before it comes to the board. So that would be probably a good point to, that as you make a motion on this, for us to continue to look at that and bring any further dialogue or discussion to the board around that. And that was why Chris called CPS yesterday, just to kind of get a perspective on it. We can look into that a little bit in a little bit more depth over the next week.
As I was looking through the rule, I'm just thinking of being a student and having this. I know the building principal does do this. Do the students themselves know who student services is? Do they know when they to contact student services what that really means?
I think I would say,
I know it sounds good here, but is it? It's like I don't know what that means. I'll just drop the principal, which they probably would anyway. But
does it make sense to put like in parentheses after it, define who those folks are? So when you're looking at student services, you're looking at the counselors, the social workers, nurse.
and maybe it's obvious. I thought about it.
But we could put it in parentheses afterwards just to define that, if that would be helpful for folks who don't know that. You okay with that, Chris?
I move that we accept these changes and move it to the full board.
Second.
All in favor?
I,
Aye.
And I'm assuming that motion is also with us continuing to look at that one issue. We'll
Yes.
bring that piece back. All right. Thanks, Chris, for all your work on this.
And moving on to expense reimbursement.
Ally and Steve, this one's yours. This is one I think that Ally you worked on, so I'll let you describe kind of what you're looking to do and why you're bringing this modification forward.
Okay, so we've had a couple of staff members address their concerns regarding expense reimbursements when they're traveling to other states for student trips. So one specifically is the WCCC grant. Their grant has different guidelines for what they're allowed to spend per meal. And since we are the fiscal agent, they've been following our policies for expense reimbursements. So they were concerned that they were having to pay for their meals because their meals in, for example, Washington DC were more expensive than the Milwaukee rates that the board uses. And then another concern was student clubs. DECA went to, I believe it was Atlanta, Georgia this spring, and their meals were a little bit more expensive too. And so we were proposing that grants that travel to other places, they could follow their grant guidelines for expense reimbursements. And then Fund 21, since those are not taxpayer dollars, they could use, they could be exempt from the next those.
Waunakee WCCS, that's Waunakee Cares Coalition. So that's we're the fiscal agent for that. So that used to be kind of a community organization. They applied for some federal grants where they needed a fiscal agent, so we serve as that. And by doing so, they follow many of our policies. But there are a few things like, as Elliot pointed out, that there are some stipulations within their grant that allow for other flexibilities, particularly on some of the reimbursable amounts. So that was a piece that we were not in congruence with, and it caused a little challenges as they were traveling and doing some of their work. So the real question is do we want to provide exemptions for for reimbursement for certain situations, such as a grant like Waunakee Cares Coalition, which operates it separately. And then also for Fund 21, which are fundraised dollars.
Randy, if I could add, as an example with Fund 21, we treat Fund 21 differently with gift cards. So our purchasing policy does not allow gift cards to come from taxpayer funds, but they are allowed out of Fund 21. And so the reason for that is Fund 21 is basically fundraised dollars. There's no taxpayer dollars going into Fund 21. So on the gift card example, if we raise funds in the community, they go into Fund 21. Our Student Financial Assistance Fund can purchase $50 gift cards from Target to give to families in need, and that is exempt from the gift card policy. Fund $10 cannot be used for gift cards, so we would not take taxpayer dollars. So the second sentence that's added up there is added with a similar thought process to the gift cards, meaning treating the funds differently because they're not taxpayer funds. So the board was comfortable with that with gift cards. The question is, are you comfortable with that with expense reimbursements? And so there's two different topics there. One topic is grant funds. You know, as Randy mentioned, there is that federal grant that's there for multiple years. The expense reimbursements are being approved by someone else in that grant. They're just higher than what our policy allows. So Ally wrote that to say that they may receive reimbursement following our policy, or if their grant allows them to go higher, we would allow that. So what we would do on our end is Ally would require seeing that. So like the grant would have to, excuse me, give her the documentation that the meals can go up to X, and then she would then know it's okay to do that. The Fund 21 piece would have no approval process to it. So that would be a little different in that if someone sent something through for Fund 21, that statement indicates that it's exempt. So you would have to decide, are you comfortable with that? So examples of that would be, again, the DECA student group raising money to go to Atlanta, Georgia, and whatever their advisor decided to do on that trip. So let's say it's an expensive meal above our maximums, we would allow it to go through if that language was approved by this committee and ultimately the board. Very parallel though to gift cards, because the DECA advisor could purchase gift cards using those fundraised funds as well, without going through an approval process because it's not taxpayer funds. So you just would have to decide on each of these two topics. Are you comfortable with the grant piece knowing someone else is approving it? Are you comfortable with the expenditure reimbursement part on Fund 21, knowing that's pretty parallel to what we're doing with gift cards? So both of these requests came from staff, and Ally wrote them up to present them to you. So you can see, you know, what it is that folks are saying to us have been concerns of theirs with this policy.
Can you give an example, Steve or Ally, about where some other examples of Fund 21? And certainly we talk about fundraising, but where does that really fall when we really truly look at kind of the reimbursement? Where are the entities that that's coming from? And so that you can at least have an understanding of what that
Um, as far as like which clubs and
Yeah,
stuff.
like what does it, just to give an idea, like what does a club, can you give an example of some of the clubs and organizations that would fall under Fund 21 that would then qualify for this exemption if that's the direction we want?
Sure, so the one that did address their concerns was DECA. They went to their national competition. I believe like FBLA was another one that would have a trip that's out of state.
So it could be like a program like DECA's one that we pay for the advisor,
Right,
but the dollars that are being used for the travel are something that they fundraise for. And then as they are traveling to some of these conferences, they're having difficulties then meeting our parameters for our policy. And then what our policy states is then you have to reimburse it personally if it goes above that. So I'll give an example of like school boards convention. This comes in quite a bit, where we'll go out to dinner in Milwaukee at the school boards convention. And if somebody has a meal that exceeds like what our limit is, then the district will pay for the whole meal. And then we'll figure out what does the individual person then owe above that. So they may look at my meal and say, well, Randy, you went over by $5.50. And so then I have to reimburse the district for that amount. And I think that's what you're trying to do, is that when you're in some of these locations with students, et cetera, that it does create a place where now the reimbursable piece gets impacted by our policy. They're asking for an exclusion.
And to add to Randy's question, Fund 21 at like a high level includes a wide range of different activities. Summer athletic camps are in there. Student scholarships are in there. High school clubs are in there. Most athletic teams have 21 accounts. Elementary PTOs are in there. So there is a wide range of what is all in Fund 21. The DPI's definition of Fund 21 basically is fund-raised funds from any entity, whether it's sports or PTO, or it really doesn't matter. It's any entity that's out there raising funds. We've also had facility projects that have been Fund 21 projects because they've been donated. So it can be a wide range, but none of the money in there is taxpayer money. That's the one thing that's consistent, no matter what group it is. It is not, I'll call it taxpayer funds, either local, state, or federal. That does not happen in Fund 21. It is all fundraised money, which is why the board was comfortable before with the idea of gift cards, because in the end, it is not taxpayer dollars being used if gift cards are being purchased through Fund 21 for whichever particular activity is doing it, but it's not allowed in our taxpayer funds.
Couple comments. The ground transportation, taxi bus rental, I assume it's not that's not limited to those. Taxi would refer to things like Uber or Lyft, you know. It's just not noted there. It's not like a, for example, type of thing.
We could certainly have the word ride sharing in there, Ted, because that would be a little bit more modern, to use that term, than taxis.
Yeah, put Milwaukee in there. What is a And then you make a note to say funds shall not be used for purchases of alcoholic beverages. Now I imagine the limit anyway, there's no way you're gonna get a bill, it's gonna have a tip on it, it's gonna have most likely drinks like that on there. I don't know how that gets excluded or taken out in, I'm just curious the thoughts on that.
What we ask people to do is to separately, so if there's a group of adults at an event, we ask them to handle that separately. So separate bill outside of the bill that would be turned in for reimbursement. And if someone was not aware of that and then did that, we would only allow the calculation of the tip based on what the district would reimburse, not something we would not reimburse.
We just upped that, I believe, a few years ago, because it was
15.
Yeah, it was 15, and I think there were times when I think we put that range from 15 to 20. Yeah, like anything with like alcoholic beverages, if adults went out, the board went out. That was a piece, then we do that on a separate, usually on someone's, you pay that privately as opposed to running it through the school. And if it ever did run through the school, that would have to be.
Questions?
Well, I appreciate you giving the examples. I'm trying to wrap my head around. So DECA raises money to go to Atlanta for nationals. And they decide to celebrate a win or whatever. They have a nice meal and they decide to go for a steak dinner. And they're utilizing their fundraising money to do that. And that's within the budget, but their fundraising money, not the fundraising money from somebody else.
Yes.
And so they use their money. And so we want to say, you can use your money to have this meal to celebrate this win. I just wanted to make sure
That's the
that I
basic
understood it.
questions. Are you okay with that? Otherwise, they have to follow our policy, which has tighter restrictions.
Yep.
Okay, sorry, it took me.
No, it's a
Understand
great
that.
question. Great.
Yeah,
Point it out.
so they each, in our accounting system, Ally has them all set up as individual groups. So like if DECA emailed Ally and said, how much money do we have? She could very easily tell them, you have X in your account. So even though I'm saying like Fund 21, they all have their own inside of there. So it's almost like each of them have their own checking account. And so they know, like going to this trip, they know they have X in there. And so they either would or would not be able to do that steak dinner based on their balance. You know, so there's a lot of groups that wouldn't be able to do that because they just don't have enough money in their account. But there would be others that would be able to do so. And again, it's just more of kind of a philosophical thing as to whether or not ultimately the board is comfortable with groups doing that and potentially exceeding our limits. And just, I mean, there's no question it opens up the door to the possibility of something maybe that in the end, people would look at it and say, I don't think that's a good use of money. But the gift card opens that door up too, right? That we could look at something that a group is doing and say, we don't necessarily think that's a good use of resources. But we know a lot of good things are happening with the gift cards. And so we open that up.
So what happens to the funds at the end of the year? Do they roll over to the next year?
Yep.
So whatever is raised this year, we don't use, we'll have it next year.
Yep.
Is there a general category then? Each one has their own specific, but is there also like a petty cash or, you know, like a little thing that says, oh, this fund has this much that could be used across any of them? Nope. No. Okay.
All segregated out.
And I will say there is an alternative option that if this makes you uncomfortable, now it just creates a little bit more prior planning. But when this policy was put together years ago, the board requested that the business office identify maximums for meals based on a federal calculated amount in Wisconsin. And the amounts for Madison and Milwaukee right now are the same, but the discussion was around like the school board convention. It is possible to look up the numbers in other parts of the country that are more expensive. Now that's just going to take planning though. I mean, basically like before a group would go to Atlanta, they'd have to look it up and know what that number is. And then the business office would have to know, okay, this trip that's going to Atlanta can use a different number. The advantage of that is it is set by the federal government based on the cost of living in that area. And at least someone is setting it. So it doesn't like open the door to just $100 meal per person. It does open the door to it being more expensive than Wisconsin. That's another option we wrote the language to have it be parallel to the gift card language. But if you look at that and that causes you to be uncomfortable, there is another, I'll call it middle ground, which could be Fund 21 expenditures that are out of state could use the federal reimbursement amounts instead. So I'm just throwing that out there that like, if that is uncomfortable, there are other options kind of in between. And you just would have to let us know what you think in general you'd be comfortable with. I think the groups that are traveling outside of Wisconsin to higher cost areas, in general, what they're looking for is some flexibility, because the rates in our policies are based on Wisconsin, which makes sense, right? I would say 90+% of our reimbursements are from Wisconsin. So we wouldn't want to set our rates to like New York's rates.
Right.
But there are student groups that go to New York. There's student groups that go to Washington, DC. And I'm sure they would prefer to use those rates, which just would give them a little more flexibility than our rates. So that's an idea. If you aren't comfortable with it, just exempting them would allow any group, even in Wisconsin, to do that steak dinner and go higher. I'm sure the student groups would prefer the language that Ally wrote. But if that would cause you to be uncomfortable, there's maybe a middle ground that we could also explore. The grants, I don't think have much of it. The way we wrote that language, someone else is approving that, right? Someone's approving that grant, being able to go on an X trip to spend X amount. It's just the second sentence really does open that up. And you'd have to be comfortable with that idea if you wanted to approve something like that.
I guess I like more what you're saying there. Is it the higher of the two then also? Because you could potentially go to a place where like you're not requiring, you're only gonna get reimbursed this much. So it's probably the higher of the two that are you get that choice, but they need to do that. It seems like it probably deals with it better.
I think it puts more structure around it.
Correct.
So that, certainly trust everybody's gonna, do the right thing, but we don't wanna
Correct.
have a situation. So I think it just adds more structure. That other language, but it adds that other piece for them to have to do that extra resource or extra research to figure out what that number is.
I mean, as an example of what that could look like, it could say very similar to the grant sentence that Ally wrote. Fund 21 expenditures may receive expense reimbursements following this policy, or the amount approved for their out-of-state trip if that amount is higher. And we could put the official language of what the federal government's title is in there, but it would look very similar to that first sentence.
I think I like that.
That sounds good.
Yeah. So we need to make a motion to approve
With that.
the first part and the second part with the new language that you just said.
Yep.
So I would make a motion to approve the grant funds part of that change, and then also adjust the language in the second sentence to reflect the example that you just provided.
And I'm thrilled to say.
Okay.
All in favor?
Aye.
Nice discussion.
Nice.
Very good. Next issue, proof of residency.
Proof of residency is one that Julie Gangler, our district registrar, is bringing forward. You can kind of scroll down. This is actually a policy that when you look in the policy resource guide, you're not going to find one on proof of residency. It's going to be enrollment. It's going to be a much larger, robust policy. It's going to roll a lot of our policies into one. So that'll be a conversation we'll have down the line. Our immediate need right now, though, is looking at what do you need in order to prove residency. And this has all changed over time because with the onset of all of the internet and how you can change your address to show proof, it's not that you're getting a mailing of some of these things. You can go and look at and change your telephone cable cell service just on your own online and then print something out that shows that you live. But it's really not a proof of residency. And so it's a piece that I know that she's worked with some of her colleagues around other districts that made this change. And they've really kept it to some things like within like a utility bill of some nature that shows kind of your residency. Obviously, when we have homelessness, that's a whole different issue. But this is really trying to show true residency and where it falls. That was a piece that she felt that there needed to be some clarification, particularly as she enters her busy season of enrolling kids. Steve, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just share that when we created this policy, 2008, we needed some guidance on new families that were approaching us and stating that they have residency within our community. And we did run into situations where in the past individuals would state that they had moved into the community and they really hadn't. So we added a policy that defined what was acceptable documentation. It's not intended to be burdensome at all with families, but it's intended to make sure there's a variety of documents that someone could pick to show that they are a resident in our community. And as Randy stated, it's becoming too easy to just change telephone, cable, cell service, et cetera, bills without actually moving. You can't do that with a gas or electric bill, but you can do that with the other ones that we're crossing out. And Julie has noticed that those are no longer, I'll call them official documents that we should be using to verify that someone is in our community. We certainly don't want someone going onto their cell phone service online account, changing their address. They don't receive paper, let's say invoices or bills from them, printing that out then and saying, hey, look, I really live here, when in fact they have not moved. So we feel like we have to remove those options for families. There's still plenty of options on the list. We just think that we need to tighten up what we accept in that particular line to things that you can't just go online and change.
Seems like it's possible to, still not live there with some of them, right? Real estate tax bill. Well, I could purchase a home, right? So how does that definitely say that this is, do you need to go beyond that? It's like, oh, if I got the real estate tax bill, good.
So it depends. So like if you gave us a real estate tax bill for a property in the business park, we wouldn't accept it. So we will look it up to verify that it's an actual residential property. So I can see now why you're asking that question, because probably that first line should say a residential real estate tax bill.
Well, not only that, you could have multiple residences. If I want to get into this district, I can just go buy a home now.
Right. If someone did do that and had multiple residences, they would be able to do that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Residency, there's lots of different pieces. You have like a divorce family, mom lives in Sun Prairie and dad lives here. They can really choose which district they have. Residency either way, even if they split time the kid. Also, rural kids, you have to remember rural kids with why they have it. There's also reasons, things that you have to be really cautious of from a state law perspective of how we count students. Part of why these pieces are important, because there's money tied to residents, because that's how we count our student count is what drives our financial system.
Yeah, and you just know that our registrar does an excellent job, like really verifying to the best of our ability. We recently did have a request come in that actually referenced a non-residential property that she found by doing online research, which we just didn't approve then. So we do definitely take the proof of residency process seriously. But there's no question, depending on the lengths to which someone might be willing to go, they could provide some type of document for us and potentially be having two residences, two actual properties. As an example, the lease one, without question, someone could sign a lease in our community, prove that lease to us, but then also own a property somewhere else. That probably has happened in the past. And it does permit that. However, most districts, do have a standard set of documents that they accept like these and do not go further in trying to verify that you're actually going to that apartment, after school. I mean, most districts don't do that.
So I'll make a motion to approve this adjustment to this policy.
Add that word residential to it.
Oh, yeah.
Can I ask a question? I'm not as familiar with the registration or enrollment policies, but is there something in there, kind of going back to what we talked about with students who are experiencing homelessness? If they don't have proof of residency, what are our processes, right? So,
Great question.
because that can't be a barrier. If we have students who are staying at an apartment with someone else, they don't have proof of residency, but we need to enroll immediately based on their situation. So do we cross-reference it to this policy? Do we add language in, or is it referenced in a different policy about registration?
I know Julie has a process for that.
Right.
But it's not referenced here. So that's a good question. Maybe a statement should be added. You can help us with that.
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, these
That's a
policies
great
change all the
question.
time. so.
Maybe we should add something in here about the homeless piece and either reference it to another policy
Yeah.
or.
Or a
what we
sentence
can-
in the
And we
paragraph.
can even see what, as I obviously Julie registers the students who
Right.
are homeless. So we can check on what her policy is and link that to that. So part of your motion could be to modify the first bullet point to residential and then also see what language we could add with regards to addressing the homeless.
Great.
I'll second that revision.
All in favor?
I-
Aye.
Aye. Next issue, flag policy.
All right. This one's complicated, as we've obviously been talking about it for a while. So let me kind of give you a little bit of background, just so everybody's kind of caught up on that. And then let me talk to you about the Boston case and what I learned from talking to Kirk Strang. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of a flow chart of at least where some of our options are. So first of all, we do fly what we've titled now as commemorative flights. And we have Pride flag flies in June. We have the Ho-Chunk flag flies in November. Juneteenth flag flies in February. And we recently approved the mental health awareness flag to fly in May. I think the board's last action was that there weren't going to be any new commemorative flags approved until there was some clarification more around this topic. One of the things that I recommended to the committee was, let's see where this Boston case comes out. So the Boston case was really an issue of, there was a municipal building in Boston, this is at a real high level, that had a third flagpole that they flew hundreds of flags on, and they were commemorative flags. So they represented different groups, different entities, etc. And then there was a request from a religious group to fly a Christian flag, at which they denied. And they felt they needed to deny it based on the whole separation of church and state and promoting of religion. That found its way into the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court really, as I was talking to Kirk, they really divided this into, this gives us some guidance, but it's not like an absolute. It's going to give you kind of a fork in the road and a couple of things to look at. It really just, the question came down to, was that flagpole being used to promote government speech private speech. So was it something that was based off, I'm going to try and steal some of Kurt's language here, is the flagpole a way for us as a school district board to promote kind of our identity, our agenda, our ideas? So was it a conscious decision of the district saying this is who we are? And we fly a flag for that purpose, or which would then be constituted as government speech? And I'm being very simplistic in these definitions because they're more complicated than this. Or is it something called private speech? Even though it's flying on our controlled flagpole, is it something that we are allowing it as a vehicle for either the community to provide and express their identity, their agenda, or ideas? You have more ability to have a say when it's the government controlled speech, when it's about your ideals, as opposed to when you have something that you put out that's private speech, but you've just allowed access to. So in this case, the Boston case viewed it that their flagpole was an instrument of private speech. Hence, they couldn't discriminate against a religious organization flying the flagpole. So the question that it comes down to for us is it really has two levels of questions. The first one is, do you want to be, do you want to have a policy that articulates that you want to fly, that you want to have the ability to fly commemorative flags per policy? So if your answer to that is yes, then we have to go down another level of questionings and then decide what kind of speech do we want our policy to represent. So we're okay with commemorative flags, but then is it something that is going to be government speech, or are we going to open it up to private speech? Kurt reiterated with me, student speech is private speech, it's not government speech. So if you have a club at the high school that wants to fly a flag because it represents kind of their beliefs in their system, then that is not government speech, that is private speech, which then opens up to basically then needing to create criteria as far as how you're going to look at that. Because you can still limit it. You obviously don't have to allow anything that would promote violence, etc. There's ways to prevent against it. But it really depends on how you write your policy. So if you decide we don't want to have commemorative flags, we want to fly the American flag and the Wisconsin flag, and you're silent on the rest of it, that is an option. But if you decide you want to go to a place where we are also, in addition to the US flag and the Wisconsin flag, we're going to be open to commemorative flags, then we have to decide how we're going to write the rest of our policy based on either a government speech perspective or a private speech perspective. And that's where you get into the nuances where we're going to have to work with our attorney on. It's not one I can really easily just delineate for you. You are able to, as Kirk said, even if you decide to go to private speech and wanted to have that, you have to then have language that would articulate in your policy to make sure that you're not discriminatory. And if you're looking at it from a government speech perspective, then you have to have language that's going to clearly define kind of how you're going to work within those limits. So those are pieces that, if those are directions that at a high level you'd want me to go to, I would need to then work with Kurt to bring you back some ideas of that. But the first prong in the flow chart is, do you want to have a policy that includes commemorative flags? And if the answer to that is yes, then we have to go down the next piece. If you say no, then it's a whole different conversation because we don't need to go there.
Do you know,
Go ahead.
do you know what other schools in the state do? Like
There's-
some of your, like,
If you look in the policy resource guide, there is no guidance on this. So the School Board Association doesn't have policies around this. This is a relatively new issue. There's not a lot of schools that I think fly a lot of commemorative flags. Kind of a new topic, to be quite frank. I mean, you see, I think Madison School District flew the Pride flag last year. There's a few others that have, but it's not one that I'm seeing a lot of conversation around. So most of my colleagues, I just don't have good experience to really answer that question well.
Okay, so like
But certainly you have, I mean, I think Joan brought up an example at one of our meetings a while back was, if you had a exchange student from Sweden, would you ever at some point say, you know, we have to us say thank you for coming to our school for the year. Would you ever fly like this, the flag from Sweden, just to commemorate that student? That'd be an example of something you could do. But how do you want to articulate stuff like that in a policy? Because that would be an additional type of a flag. And that's a question I'm going to have to kind of discern through. Now, I think that would fall under kind of governmental speech, kind of something that you are deciding to do to represent something that's an ideal that you support for exchange students, for example.
I think it's interesting that they said student speech is not government
It's private
speech.
speech, so that's why I'm curious, how do they make?
It's like that would be the exchange student, you're just kind of.
Could be, and that's where I said it gets really sticky. So like,
yeah.
you can articulate that, yes, we support X student group. Every student, but does every student group represent the mission and vision of the district? That's going to say this is what we stand.
But when we
So that's
okay,
at least how I'm understanding it. That's the government speech piece.
when we okay a club, whatever, it falls within the parameters of what we're trying to do as a district to include kids, and it's a positive. There's a positive reason for having that club. We're not going to support the KKK club. You know, we would cut that off there. So if we've already said it's an appropriate club to have at school.
Right.
It seems to me that elevates it more from student speak to an organized sanctioned speech from the school board.
Right, and I think that's where it gets really confusing.
Yeah.
And and I think part of what Kirk is saying, and it kind of goes back to his statement, it goes, are you looking at your flagpole and is that going to be promoting your agenda as a board? Is that your beliefs? Whatever flies there, that's your belief. Or are you promoting somebody else's speech, even though you support it?
Yeah.
Are you supporting, I mean, we've got groups, we have 60 some clubs, they all don't agree on what their interests or their ideals are. But we support all of those because we want to support our students. But is that speech representative of what the district is saying is our ideal? And so his view is, it's not just, he wanted me to make sure I made that clear. It's not just, is it a place for community ideals? It's under community is also students.
So I think that's where I've had the problem with this too. I don't think there's a real objective in making that determination one over the other, the objectiveness. I think some argument in the past, from past members were, if it was related to school, like that's your objective thing. Everything could be related to school and learning. That's what school is. We're learning about all kinds of things, but I think that gets pretty gray.
Right, and that's where when you go back to the Boston case, their decision was built around the ideals of government speech versus private. And that's where Kirk is kind of looking at this is now, what do you view as government speech and what is private speech? And trying to not discern kind of how those two play out. It's probably a piece that's going to continue to be, going to need some additional question and answer piece. And it may be a piece I just have to bring Kirk in to really have that dialogue around that, because you start to get into some very specific the line, and I the words I use, I said the line between government and private can be pretty thin. And he said, yes. So it's not like you can, and he goes, well, and he goes, one indication of government speech, but it's not the only one. He goes, it could be that one of your criteria that defines it as government speech is that it is part of your ideals, it is part of what you, and you have funded it. So do we fund it? Is it something that we put funds behind? Because that's not the determining factor, but that could be one criteria. as opposed to another group who's bringing something forward. We support it because we support our students, we support our student groups. And then, but they're the ones kind of funding that speech as it goes up. So it's absolutely a complicated issue. And that's about as far as I can get into the legalities of it. But I think the question that really comes to the committee is I think there's a few options for you. One, you either kind of make a decision as a committee or a full board as far as where do you want to go with commemorative flights, yes or no? And that's a question. And then the other piece is if yes, that you want to at some point, you don't want to completely shut that door, but then you have to go down the next tier, which is defining what kind of speech you would support and or where you're going to write your policy. And then under those, then there has to be language that makes sure that what we are doing and how we are doing it is not discriminatory. I look at the Boston case, they viewed it as private speech, which then didn't allow them to deny the flag that brought them to the case. So it opens it up broader. You can still put parameters to it, but it has to be parameters such as what Kirk and I were talking about. It can't be something that's going to promote violence, etc. So some of the other, not really helping me a lot here, but because it is a super complicated topic.
There was another case, wasn't there as well? Did that apply? Didn't reference it.
Didn't reference it at all. The one I was talking to him specifically about was that the other piece I brought up to him, we just talked about like our advertising policy.
Yeah.
And he said, well, similar, but very different.
Okay.
And because I was trying to apply similar type concepts. He goes, some of the concepts are the same legally, but it's also different because one, you're selling advertising and there's something that you're purchasing versus something that is a speech. So there's some different nuance. So he told me because you got to keep those separate. They're related in some respects, but they're separate as far as the discussion. So I think there's a couple options. One is that kind of make some determination that this committee to say kind of what direction you'd like to at least explore, and I can bring some of that back. This could be a piece we have a further conversation, or at least provide an update to the board at our next board meeting of where we're at. Could be a piece that I ask Kirk to come in with some specific answers to some of your questions, or to speak more from a much more of a legal perspective of what those two things mean, and we can think through, are there other types of things we would ever put on our flagpole, and how does that fit, regardless of how we write the policy. There's a lot of room here for us to, it's not something we're going to have a policy to bring to the board at the next meeting. It's going to be a process. I think kind of holding status quo of where we are is a good place. Okay. Because we've got to work through this, because there's not, as you're pointing out, there's not a lot of, there's really, we're kind of breaking a little bit of new ground as far as how we have to write this. And this case was one that's really.
You also, maybe I'm not sure if I was thinking something else, but you could not have a policy. You know, we could say we're not going to do like other districts, and it's gone, and we're doing what we are currently, where people present something to us and we approve it as a board as I want to fly this honorary flag, just like we're doing now. That's one side as well. Or if we do go down this road and let's say we ended it at, we're not going to fly commemorative flags, what do we do with those honorary flags? Are they going to continue to fly, or do we have to sit as a board and say we're no longer going to fly those? I think that has to happen as well.
There's what type of speech are we allowing? And so that's the other piece, regardless of the policy. It's going back to like the Boston piece. I mean, they're kind of going off of, you know, we've approved certain flags to fly right now. Yeah, and it's through resolution. And the question is, if there was one to be brought, let's just say Judy brought a question to the board, and the board said, well, no, we're not going to. Does it bring up a challenge to the government versus private speech, and making an argument similar to what we have with the Boston case? I just think we have to clarify it at some point. So even if we don't have a probably need some level of a policy that talks about what we're doing with flags. That's my take. Because in the absence of a policy, you can still create speech. And that can still be a piece that could put us into a place where we at least have to know kind of how we're approving those or what our criteria is.
Well,
It's very complicated.
I don't, as we've talked about it in the past, or the first part of the policy, I don't think anyone's had any issue with, you know, so if you really wanted, you could move and say, well, we do have a flag policy, that's what it is, and the rest could be for debate, if we modify over time. There's a discussion of commemorative flags, because the first part doesn't change at all. We fly those American flag and the US flag. I mean, Wisconsin flag. That's our policy, that's what we do. And then this, or you wait to come up with something entirely, which is, like you said, it's gonna be a long discussion.
I almost think, Ted, right now, I would just wait on approving anything until we kind of sort out the issue. Because there's nothing that says our history, right now, what we have is we fly the US flag and we fly the Wisconsin flag. We have the 4 flags by resolution that we're flying right now. After, we're just into June, so the pride flag is flying this month. The next item that's coming forward is November. So we probably need to have a point where we make some decisions between now and that point to see where we're going to be. That may be kind of to see how we're going to continue moving forward there and what's our criteria for that. I hate having to bring the attorneys into it, but this one's so complicated. I think you need to have some deeper discussion on it and being able to kind of discern and think through what other types of flags would we fly. So if we fly things like a flag for an exchange student, which I think is a great example of something that we would want to do, we might do at some point. How does that fit into, if you just have a flag that's flying the US flag and the Wisconsin flag, does that prevent it?
I guess it's only complicated if you make it complicated, right? You could honor these in different ways. That's, you know, I think we talked to that, or it doesn't even become an issue that way. We said it, this is a policy, and let's deal with that somehow.
And that was the other piece I asked. I said, well, when you start to talk about honoring it in different ways, which is our other discussion, then it gets into, that's the same issue. It's just now put into instructional stuff. So they're all very similar. The advertising, flagpole, things once you enter the doors in school and in a classroom are all very similar, but they all have different nuances to them. And those are all things we're going to have to address. That's part of where there's continued dialogue around this, and there's more and more, you know, displays of belief systems that are being illustrated. And how do we kind of then provide some guidance for where those are appropriate, what we're going to sanction, and what's kind of our lines. Right now, we've gone the route of really very little policy on flags to approving resolutions, which is definitely a power of the board to do, to now trying to create a flag policy that not only addresses the Wisconsin and the US flag, but also the concept of commemorative flags, which then brings in this whole discussion.
When you look at the third bullet up there on commemorative flags, they must have been flown last
Oh,
year.
sure.
Do you know what that list is?
I haven't looked that up. I think that was something I pulled from the village's policy as part of it. No, I'd have to look that one up.
I guess I'd be curious to know what
Sure.
has been flown, either the US Capitol or our state capitol. What have they recognized?
Sure. Good question. Let me find that out.
I make a motion that we table this for further discussion.
Just a comment, we can table it, but let's guess it was a good discussion. We gotta keep, let's not continue to just keep pumping down.
Checking into those things.
What I can do is I can give an update, and Joan, you and I are meeting after this meeting to talk about our agenda for the next board meeting. I have it on there. It could be just an update, kind of what we've learned with regards to this. And I can see if I can get some different example pieces that are a little bit more detailed to this, but I want to be really cautious that I don't step down a road that I'm not speaking accurately. It's a really
Yeah.
challenging discussion. But it's probably a piece that we need to us to be thinking, probably need to bring Kirk in and say, okay, let's talk through and figure out what our questions are. And then we decide kind of how we want to do that. Because even if you had, if we take kind of Ted, your piece with regards to you just take the first page of the flag policy and you don't have the commemorative piece. Short of saying that you're not going to consider any, a phrase that says we're not going to even consider anything else. Does it prevent anybody from bringing something forward? So we don't have a policy now and we've had resolutions before. So I think you have to, because that in and of itself then creates the same issue we're talking about with regards to private and government speech. I think we have to really get a good handle on what that is, since we're in the space right now. How are we currently being kind of structured? And then how do we want to be structured? That's kind of, that's the piece I think we need to determine. And is there anything that if you went with just the first page of the policy that precludes you from doing something down the line? Or if you are going to do something down the line, is it in your legal best interest to make sure you have policy on it? My guess is that's going to be the best. You're going to want to have some guidance to it if you want to open that door at all.
Okay.
So
We actually have to have an action table.
I mean, if there's no second, your motion dies the table. That's, we can just.
Well, I'm just, I mean, if we're tabling, we don't need an action, do we?
no,
'Cause
no,
it's still-
I just
it's
thought we
just a
should keep
discussion.
discussing.
Yeah.
So,
This was really just to kind of give you an update on where we're at.
yeah,
There's a direction we wanted to go. It allowed us for that option. But I think what I would do is just continue to update where it is. And I think it's going to be a piece we're going to have to, I can bring some additional pieces back here. It may be a point that I just bring Kirk into our next meeting to talk to us. Maybe he comes to the full board too, but maybe a piece I just have him zoom into our next meeting.
sure.
That might be a good place to go. And I can give him some specific kind of questions as we've talked through it. And that help discern kind of how those relate or don't relate to some of the other issues that have been brought up. That's fair.
Good info. Thanks. Greg.
Thank you.
Guess it comes to future meetings. We want to turn them in.
And what I'd like to do is there a time of the day that works well? What I'd like to do is just put out the schedule for the year. And then we can change it if we need to. But at least if we're gonna meet on kind of a continual basis, does things in the morning like this work for folks?
I like it.
If you like this?
I can do it.
Does that work for you, Katie?
Yes.
So if we did something at like 8 o'clock, and what I'm thinking is that we would just do it kind of the
First Thursday of the month.
first Thursday of.
When does Dunkin'
Well, and
Donuts
that
open?
makes. I'm just trying to think, if we have it the first, we're trying to,
It would always be before the board meeting then, but like just before. So like July would be July 7th. Maybe unless you want it more like the fourth Thursday, that would give you more time to do anything for the boards.
well, that's my thought, is if there was something that happened at the committee, that would give you and I time to get it ready for the board.
Maybe the third or fourth Thursday.
Fourth. How we look at like, did those generally work if we did it like 8 o'clock on like a consistent day? It's a Thursday or a Wednesday, a Thursday, is there any day of the week that doesn't work? As we start looking at our schedule,
Yeah, Wednesday is better than Thursday.
is there one that's better? Wednesdays usually
Thursday's
don't
great.
work. I usually have cabinet on those days, but Tuesday, a Thursday, is it?
I think either are fine.
Any
Yeah.
of those?
Whatever is.
Tuesday, Thursday is good.
Why don't we just look, and what we'll do is we'll put together a schedule, I'll shoot it out just to see where
Okay.
people are. And then we'll just at least present that to the board when we meet, so we have kind of a year-long schedule.
Sounds good.
Awesome.
I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I guess.
Second.
All in favor?
This is such a
Aye.
fun